February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. The morning air tasted of sulfur and spent cordite. In a makeshift analysis facility carved into the volcanic rock near the island's northern airfield, a group of Japanese tank officers stood in silence around an unexpected prize. An American M4 Sherman tank, captured intact during a confused nighttime firefight 3 days earlier, when its crew had abandoned the vehicle after throwing a track in a shell crater. Major Takeshi Yamamoto circled the machine slowly, his boots crunching on black volcanic sand that had drifted through the cave entrance. The Sherman sat under harsh electric lights powered by a stuttering generator, its olive-drab paint scorched and pitted but otherwise undamaged. To most of the men gathered in that cave, it was simply another piece of American equipment to be catalogued and reported to Tokyo. To Yamamoto, chief of the Imperial Army's 4th Tank Analysis Unit, it represented an opportunity to prove what he had believed since the Marco Polo Bridge, that American armor was built by factories, not craftsmen, and that Japanese technical superiority would ultimately prevail despite material disadvantages. He had spent 14 years designing and testing tanks for the Kwantung Army, believing that Japanese engineering discipline combined with warrior spirit could overcome any mechanical advantage the Americans might possess. The Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks he had helped develop carried 47mm guns that seemed adequate against Chinese armor and early American light tanks. Their crews were trained in tactics that emphasized ambush and surprise, using terrain to offset the weight and firepower advantages of enemy vehicles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Standing beside the Sherman's glacis plate, Yamamoto ran his hand across the welded steel, noting the rough finish that German reports had mocked as crude American craftsmanship. The armor was thick, perhaps 76mm at the front, more than double the protection on his own tanks. But thickness alone did not win battles, he told himself. Battlefield reports from Tarawa and Saipan had described American tanks moving with methodical precision, but those same reports mentioned mechanical breakdowns and vulnerability to prepared positions. Lieutenant Kazuo Tanaka stood near the turret, studying the 75mm gun that dominated the vehicle's profile. He was younger than most of the others, a recent graduate of the tank school at Chiba, who still believed in the technical briefings that described American equipment as wasteful and over-engineered. The gun barrel looked enormous compared to the 47mm weapons he had trained on, but size did not equal effectiveness, and Japanese doctrine emphasized that well-placed shots from lighter guns could defeat heavier armor through superior positioning and crew skill. The cave itself amplified every sound. The generator's diesel rumble, the scrape of boots on stone, the metallic ping of cooling metal as the Sherman's engine ticked down from the test drive that had brought it here. Outside, the sound of American artillery drifted across the island with the regularity of a heartbeat, each distant thump a reminder that time was running out for the garrison. But inside this cave, the war seemed distant, almost abstract, as if the presence of this captured machine had created a bubble where technical analysis could proceed according to peacetime rules. Yamamoto had ordered his team to conduct a complete examination of the Sherman's capabilities, particularly its fire control and ammunition handling systems. Japanese tanks suffered from reload speeds that seemed adequate during training, but became liabilities in actual combat when enemy armor could engage and destroy targets faster than Japanese crews could respond. If he could identify weaknesses in American loading procedures, perhaps Japanese crews could exploit those vulnerabilities to offset their disadvantages in armor and gunpowder. The men who gathered in that cave represented the best technical minds the Imperial Army could spare from a collapsing perimeter. Captain Hiroshi Saito had commanded a company of Type 97 tanks during the fighting on Saipan, surviving the destruction of his unit only because his vehicle had thrown a track before the American ambush that annihilated the rest of his column. Sergeant Major Kenji Watanabe had been a gunner in the Manchurian campaigns, where Japanese armor had faced Chinese equipment that was often inferior in every measurable category. They approached the Sherman with the confidence of men who had studied American technical manuals captured in the Philippines, documents that described maintenance procedures and tactical employment with the kind of bureaucratic detail that Japanese officers found both impressive and revealing. The Americans seemed to assume that their crews needed extensive documentation to operate equipment properly, suggesting a lack of the intuitive mechanical understanding that Japanese training emphasized. Yamamoto ordered the turret hatch opened so they could examine the interior fighting compartment. When the heavy steel door swung upward, the smell of gun oil and sweat drifted out, mixed with the faint chemical tang of propellant residue. The interior was surprisingly spacious compared to Japanese tanks, with enough room for the crew to move without the cramped contortions that made Japanese loading procedures so physically demanding. The 75mm gun dominated the space, its breech mechanism almost elegant in its mechanical simplicity. Yamamoto noted the well-placed controls, the padded seats for the gunner and loader, the organized storage racks that held ammunition in positions where it could be accessed quickly. Everything about the layout suggested that American designers had prioritized crew efficiency over the weight savings that Japanese doctrine demanded. Tanaka climbed into the loader's position, familiarizing himself with the arrangement of ammunition stowage and the physical movements required to service the main gun. The ready racks held artillery-style rounds, each one comprising a separate projectile and powder charge that needed to be loaded in sequence. The weight of each component was substantial, perhaps 20 pounds for the projectile alone, but the layout minimized the distance the loader needed to move between retrievals and loading. They had captured American technical manuals along with the tank, documents that described proper loading procedures with the kind of step-by-step detail that left nothing to interpretation. Yamamoto studied these papers under the harsh electric light, noting that American doctrine specified sustained rates of fire that seemed impossibly fast compared to Japanese capabilities. The manuals claimed that well-trained crews could maintain 6 to 8 rounds per minute, speeds that would require mechanical precision and physical endurance that Japanese loaders struggled to achieve under combat conditions. The confidence in that cave was built on assumptions that had served the Imperial Army well in earlier campaigns. Japanese tanks had defeated Chinese armor through superior tactics and crew training, proving that mechanical advantages could be overcome through discipline and warrior spirit. The Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks carried guns that were adequate for infantry support missions, and their lighter weight allowed tactical mobility that heavier American tanks supposedly lacked. Yamamoto had read the intelligence reports from Saipan describing how American tanks had destroyed entire Japanese armored formations through superior firepower and coordination. But those reports also mentioned ammunition shortages and mechanical failures that suggested American equipment was not invincible. If Japanese crews could exploit the reload cycle, forcing American tanks to expose themselves while servicing their guns, perhaps the material disadvantage could be overcome through tactical innovation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the Sherman look almost sinister in its mechanical complexity. Every gauge, every control, every carefully positioned component spoke to a design philosophy that assumed resources were unlimited and that crew comfort directly improved combat effectiveness. It was wasteful by Japanese standards, inefficient, the kind of industrial excess that should have made the vehicle vulnerable to more disciplined opponents. Saito examined the gun's recoil mechanism, noting the hydraulic cylinders that absorbed firing shock and returned the barrel to battery position automatically. Japanese tanks used simpler systems that required manual adjustment after each shot, a procedure that added seconds to the reload cycle but saved weight and manufacturing complexity. The American approach seemed typical of their industrial philosophy, throwing machinery at problems that Japanese discipline solved through training and willpower. Outside the cave, the artillery continued its steady drumbeat, each impact reminding them that American firepower was not theoretical but immediate and overwhelming. The island was being systematically pulverized by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment that seemed to have no regard for ammunition conservation. Japanese defenders huddled in caves and tunnels, emerging only when American infantry came close enough to engage with small arms and grenades. The Sherman represented more than captured equipment. It was a window into the industrial capacity that was slowly grinding Japanese resistance into volcanic dust. Every component, every gauge, every carefully machined part spoke to manufacturing capability that Japan could not match even under ideal conditions. The armor plates were uniform in thickness, the welds professionally executed, the mechanical systems built with tolerances that suggested quality control procedures that Japanese industry struggled to maintain. Yamamoto ordered preparation for a live-fire test that would settle the question definitively. They would load and fire the Sherman's gun under conditions that simulated combat, measuring the actual reload speed against Japanese capabilities and determining whether the technical manual's claims were accurate or propaganda. If American crews truly could sustain 6 to 8 rounds per minute, Japanese armor doctrine would need fundamental revision. The preparations took most of the afternoon. Ammunition had to be inventoried and inspected, the gun's firing mechanism tested to ensure it would not malfunction during the evaluation. A target area was identified outside the cave entrance where shots could be fired safely without revealing the position to American observers who might call down artillery or airstrikes on anything that seemed interesting. As dusk approached, the cave took on the atmosphere of a laboratory rather than a military installation. Men moved with quiet purpose, checking equipment and recording baseline measurements with the thoroughness that Japanese technical training emphasized. They were about to conduct an experiment that would either confirm their assumptions about American equipment or force them to confront realities they had been avoiding since the war turned against them. Yamamoto stood before the Sherman one final time before the test began, his hand resting on the turret ring as if he could sense the machine's potential through physical contact. The metal was cold despite the tropical heat outside, and the rough American welds felt almost contemptuous under his fingers. Tomorrow, they would fire this gun and measure what it could do. Tomorrow, they would learn whether Japanese tactical doctrine could survive contact with American industrial reality. The generator coughed and steadied, its diesel rumble filling the cave with sound that drowned out the distant artillery. Men took their positions, some inside the tank, others stationed with stopwatches and notepads to record the timing of each action. The test would be simple. Load and fire the 75mm gun as rapidly as possible, while maintaining accuracy sufficient to hit man-sized targets at 300 meters. The narrator's voice lowers, reflective and deliberate. They believed they were conducting a technical evaluation of captured enemy equipment. In truth, they were about to witness the quantification of their own obsolescence, measured in seconds that would translate into battlefield defeat and the systematic destruction of everything they had spent their careers defending. History would record this moment not as curiosity, but as the instant when Japanese armor doctrine died in a cave on Iwo Jima, killed by a stopwatch, and the rhythmic sound of American engineering turning warfare into an industrial process that warrior spirit could not overcome. The morning of February 20th brought low clouds and the kind of humid heat that made even breathing feel like work. Inside the cave, the air was marginally cooler but thick with tension as Yamamoto's team prepared for the live-fire evaluation. The Sherman sat under the lights like a specimen awaiting dissection, its 75mm gun pointed toward the cave entrance, where volcanic rock gave way to a narrow firing lane that extended toward the island's interior. Lieutenant Tanaka had spent the previous evening studying the American loading manual, memorizing the sequence of movements that doctrine specified for optimal performance. The procedures seemed straightforward enough. Retrieve projectile from ready rack, load into breech, retrieve powder charge, insert charge, close breech, announce ready status. The manual claimed that experienced loaders could complete this cycle in approximately 6 seconds, a figure that seemed ambitious but not impossible given the efficient layout of the fighting compartment. The ammunition racks held 37 rounds of mixed types, armor-piercing, high-explosive, and white phosphorus. For the test, they had selected armor-piercing rounds that would provide consistent performance without the variables that explosive projectiles introduced. Each round comprised a pointed steel projectile weighing approximately 15 pounds, and a separate powder charge in a brass case that added another 10 pounds. The combined weight was substantial but not overwhelming for a healthy adult male. Yamamoto had designated Sergeant Watanabe to serve as loader for the initial trials, reasoning that his combat experience would provide a realistic assessment of what trained crews could achieve under pressure. Watanabe climbed into the turret basket with the practiced economy of movement that came from years in armored vehicles, positioning himself where the American loader would stand and familiarizing himself with the reach required to access ammunition and service the gun. Captain Saito took the commander's position, calling out the loading sequence so that observers outside the tank could record exact timing for each action. The gunner's station was occupied by a junior lieutenant named Nakamura, who had trained on Japanese tanks but was adapting quickly to the American fire control system. The physical arrangement inside the turret was remarkably ergonomic, with every control positioned where natural hand movement could reach it without awkward stretching or contortion. They began with dry runs, cycling through the loading procedure without actually firing to establish baseline timing and identify any coordination issues. Watanabe reached for the ready rack, extracted a projectile, pivoted toward the breech, and slid the round into the chamber with a metallic click that echoed in the confined space. The movement was smooth, but not particularly fast, taking approximately 8 seconds from rack to breech. The powder charge came next, a brass cylinder that fit snugly behind the projectile. Watanabe lifted it from its storage bin, rotated back to the breech, and inserted it with both hands, while Nakamura held the breech mechanism open. Another 6 seconds elapsed. The breech closed with a solid thunk, and Saito called out, "Ready." The entire sequence had required 14 seconds, longer than the 6-second figure claimed in the American manual, but respectable for a first attempt with unfamiliar equipment. Yamamoto observed from outside the tank, stopwatch in hand, noting the timing on a clipboard where he was building a data table that would quantify Japanese assumptions against American reality. 14 seconds per round translated to approximately 4 rounds per minute, slower than the manual's claimed rate, but potentially acceptable if Japanese crews could match that performance with their own equipment. The question was whether Watanabe could improve with practice, or if 14 seconds represented a realistic floor for trained crews. They ran the sequence again. This time, Watanabe anticipated the movements required, his muscles learning the pattern of reach, lift, pivot, and load. The projectile slid home in 6 seconds. The powder charge followed 4 seconds later. Total cycle time, 10 seconds. Better, but still short of the manual's claimed performance. Yamamoto made a notation and signaled for another repetition. By the 5th iteration, something was happening that none of them had quite expected. Watanabe's movements were acquiring the unconscious fluidity of muscle memory, his body learning to optimize each action without conscious thought. Projectile, from rack to breech, 4 seconds. Powder charge, 3 seconds. Breech closed and ready, 7 seconds total. The manual's 6-second figure suddenly seemed achievable rather than aspirational. Yamamoto felt the first whisper of unease creeping into his assumptions. If an experienced Japanese sergeant could approach American loading speeds after just 20 minutes of practice with unfamiliar equipment, what could American loaders achieve with months of training and actual combat experience? The implication was disturbing, suggesting that the reload advantage wasn't purely mechanical, but stemmed from thoughtful design that allowed average crews to perform at exceptional levels. The dry runs continued until Watanabe could consistently achieve 7 to 8 second cycles, occasionally hitting 6 seconds when all movements aligned perfectly. The pattern was clear. American ergonomics compensated for the substantial weight of 75mm ammunition by minimizing wasted motion and positioning components where natural movement could access them efficiently. Japanese tanks, in contrast, forced loaders to work around cramped spaces and awkward geometries that added seconds to every action. They broke for lunch, a meal of cold rice and pickled vegetables eaten in the cave's entrance where they could watch American aircraft prowling the coast and dropping bombs on suspected positions. The contrast between the methodical test proceeding inside the cave and the industrial violence happening outside created a cognitive dissonance that none of them acknowledged aloud. They were measuring reload speeds while the island was being systematically destroyed around them. When they resumed, Yamamoto ordered transition to live-fire conditions that would test whether Watanabe could maintain his dry-run performance while managing the physical shock and stress of actual shooting. The Sherman's engine had been started that morning and was now idling quietly. Its exhaust vented outside through a makeshift duct that kept fumes from accumulating in the confined space. The turret traversed smoothly as Nakamura tracked imaginary targets, the electric motors humming with the kind of refined power that Japanese tanks achieved only through constant maintenance. The first target was a wooden frame draped with canvas positioned 300 meters from the cave entrance, a rough silhouette that approximated an enemy tank's profile. Nakamura centered the gun sight, made a minor elevation adjustment, and reported ready. Saito gave the command to load for effect. Watanabe executed the sequence exactly as practiced. Projectile from rack into breech, 4 seconds. Powder charge, 3 seconds. Breech closed, 7 seconds total. Saito called, "Fire." The gun roared with a violence that seemed impossible to contain within the cave's confines, the muzzle blast reflecting off volcanic rock and hammering their eardrums despite the cotton wadding they had stuffed in their ears. The recoil mechanism absorbed the shock smoothly, the barrel sliding backward, and then forward again into battery position with hydraulic precision. Through the gun sight, Nakamura watched the armor-piercing round impact dead center on the target frame, punching through canvas and wood as if they weren't there. He called, "Hit," and Saito immediately ordered, "Reload." Watanabe was already moving, muscle memory executing the sequence without conscious thought. Another projectile, another powder charge, 7 seconds from shot to ready. Fire! The second round obliterated what remained of the target. Yamamoto's stopwatch read 14 seconds from first shot to second shot. He stared at the device as if it had malfunctioned. But the truth was undeniable. The Sherman could sustain rates of fire that doubled Japanese capabilities, and this was with a Japanese loader who had received less than an hour of training. What could American crews achieve with their doctrine's emphasis on sustained practice and crew coordination? They continued firing until 15. Rounds had been expended, Watanabe settling into a rhythm that became almost mechanical in its consistency. 7 seconds per cycle, sometimes 6 when everything aligned perfectly, occasionally 8 when fatigue began accumulating, or a round stuck briefly in the loading tray. The average across all 15 shots was 7.3 seconds, translating to approximately 8 rounds per minute under combat conditions. Inside the turret, the temperature had risen to unbearable levels. Spent powder gases lingered despite the ventilation fan, and the breech mechanism radiated heat that made bare skin contact painful. Watanabe's hands were blistered from handling hot brass cases, and his shoulders ached from the repetitive motion of lifting 25-pound loads every 7 seconds. But he had proven the manual's claims were accurate, or perhaps even conservative estimates of what well-trained crews could accomplish. Yamamoto called a halt and ordered everyone outside where they could breathe air that wasn't fouled with cordite. The silence after 15 shots was almost painful, their ears ringing with the memory of muzzle blast trapped in confined space. Men stood in small groups, smoking cigarettes and speaking in low voices about what they had just witnessed. No one needed to articulate what the test had revealed. American tanks could fire twice as fast as Japanese tanks, and this advantage stemmed not from mechanical gimmickry, but from thoughtful design that respected the physical realities of human performance under stress. Lieutenant Tanaka approached Yamamoto with a question that had been building since the first shot. "Sir, if we modified our loading procedures to match American efficiency, could we achieve similar results?" It was the kind of optimistic inquiry that young officers specialized in, assuming that technique alone could overcome material disadvantages. Yamamoto considered his answer carefully before responding. "Our tanks lack the internal volume to implement American ergonomics. The Type 97's fighting compartment is too small for efficient movement, and our ammunition storage interferes with the loader's working space. We cannot simply adopt their procedures without redesigning our vehicles from the foundation upward." The words hung in the humid air like an admission of systemic failure. Japanese armor doctrine had evolved around assumptions that proved inadequate when confronted with American engineering that prioritized crew performance over abstract concepts of efficiency, measured in weight savings and manufacturing. Simplification. The Sherman's design philosophy assumed that well-supported crews could achieve extraordinary results, while Japanese doctrine assumed that disciplined warriors could overcome any material disadvantage through superior spirit. As evening approached, they conducted comparison tests with captured ammunition from a destroyed Type 97 to quantify exactly how large the performance gap actually was. Using a stopwatch and simulated loading conditions outside the tank, experienced Japanese loaders averaged 12 to 14 seconds per round when working with the 47mm gun that equipped most frontline vehicles. The difference was stark. American crews could fire 2 rounds for every 1 Japanese round, effectively doubling their combat effectiveness without any advantage in armor protection or gun penetration. The implications cascaded through Yamamoto's understanding of modern armored warfare. Reload speed determined how many targets a tank could engage before enemy return fire forced it to seek cover. In the fluid engagements that characterized Pacific Island fighting, the side that could fire faster controlled the tempo of battle and could concentrate fire on priority threats while suppressing less immediate dangers. Japanese tanks, limited to 4 or 5 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, would always be at a decisive disadvantage against Shermans that could sustain 8 rounds per minute indefinitely. That night, as American artillery resumed its methodical bombardment of suspected Japanese positions, Yamamoto sat in the cave, writing a report that would never reach Tokyo. The generator had been shut down to conserve fuel, leaving only dim candlelight to write by. His brush moved across rice paper with the practiced strokes of classical calligraphy, forming characters that described what he had learned in language that tried to soften conclusions that were unacceptable to report honestly. He wrote that American tanks demonstrated superior ergonomic design that facilitated rapid ammunition handling. He noted that Japanese crews could potentially improve performance through modified training procedures, though he knew this was optimistic fiction. The truth that he could not write explicitly was that Japanese armor doctrine was obsolete and that no amount of warrior spirit could compensate. For tanks that were too small, too lightly armed, and too slowly served by crews working in cramped compartments that made sustained combat operations physically exhausting. The captured Sherman sat in darkness after the generator died, its bulk a silent monument to industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Every component, every carefully positioned control, every thoughtfully designed storage rack represented manufacturing sophistication and design philosophy that assumed warfare was an engineering problem to be solved through systematic analysis and resource allocation. Japanese doctrine assumed warfare was a test of spirit, that technique and courage could win despite material disadvantages. Outside the cave, the sound of artillery continued its steady rhythm, each explosion marking another increment in the systematic reduction of Japanese defensive positions. The island was being consumed by firepower that seemed limitless, supported by industrial capacity that could replace every expended shell faster than Japanese positions could be rebuilt. The Sherman's 7-second reload cycle was merely one data point in a larger pattern of American military effectiveness, built on the assumption that superior equipment properly employed would always defeat inferior equipment. Regardless of operator courage, Yamamoto finished his report and sealed it in an envelope that would probably never survive the island's eventual fall. He had documented the Sherman's performance with scientific precision, but he knew that numbers alone could not convey the psychological impact of watching American engineering systematically dismantle assumptions that had sustained Japanese armor doctrine since the Manchurian campaigns. The test had not simply measured reload speeds. It had quantified the gap between two civilizations' approaches to industrial warfare, measured in seconds that translated into battlefield dominance that no tactical innovation could overcome. Narrator's voice lowers to almost a whisper. Tomorrow they would resume testing, examining other aspects of American tank design. But the essential truth had already been revealed in those first 15 shots. Japanese armor was fighting a war it had already lost. defeated not by enemy courage but by enemy factories that produced tanks designed by engineers who understood that sustained performance under stress required ergonomics as much as armor plate. The warrior spirit that Japanese doctrine celebrated could not reload a gun faster than human physiology allowed, and American designers had optimized for that human reality, while Japanese designers had sacrificed it for abstract concepts of efficiency that proved meaningless under combat conditions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical analysis continued for 3 more days, each session revealing new layers of American design philosophy that challenged Japanese assumptions about armored warfare. Yamamoto had organized the evaluation into systematic categories: fire control, armor protection, mechanical reliability, and crew survivability. Each category produced data that accumulated into a comprehensive picture of why American tanks were proving so devastatingly effective in Pacific Island combat. On the second day, they examined the Sherman's fire control system with the kind of detailed attention that Japanese engineering training emphasized. The gun sight was a revelation in practical optics, offering magnification and clarity that made target identification possible at ranges where Japanese sights provided only vague shapes. Lieutenant Nakamura, who had served as gunner during the live-fire tests, spent hours peering through the sight at distant terrain features, comparing what he could see to the performance of Japanese optical systems. The American sight employed a telescopic design with multiple lenses that gathered light efficiently even under low-light conditions. Japanese tanks used simpler direct-vision periscopes that saved weight and manufacturing complexity, but severely limited the gunner's ability to identify targets at extended ranges. Nakamura could read individual numbers painted on a fuel drum at 400 meters through the Sherman's sight, a feat that would be impossible with Japanese optics at half that distance. The fire control advantage extended beyond simple magnification. The Sherman's gun mounting system employed a gyrostabilizer that compensated for vehicle movement, allowing reasonably accurate fire while the tank was in motion. Japanese tanks required complete halts before firing to achieve any accuracy, a tactical disadvantage that forced them to sacrifice mobility for the opportunity to shoot. American crews could engage targets while maneuvering, maintaining momentum that made them harder to hit while sustaining their own fire output. Captain Saito had commanded tanks on Saipan and remembered the frustration of trying to engage moving American armor while his own vehicle had to stop, aim, fire, and then reposition before the enemy could return accurate fire. The Sherman stabilization system eliminated that vulnerability, allowing continuous engagement even across rough terrain that would have forced Japanese tanks into immobility. The psychological advantage was immense. American crews could press attacks, while Japanese crews were forced into defensive positions where superior American firepower could concentrate on static targets. The armor examination on the third day revealed construction techniques that spoke to manufacturing capacity Japan could not hope to match. The Sherman's frontal armor consisted of rolled, homogeneous steel plate welded into a hull configuration that provided both protection and structural strength. The welds themselves were professionally executed, uniform in appearance, and free of the defects that plagued Japanese armor production as raw material quality declined under Allied blockade pressure. Yamamoto measured the thickness at multiple points, confirming that the frontal protection ranged from 63 to 76 millimeters, depending on the specific plate. Japanese Type 97 tanks carried maximum armor of 33 millimeters on the turret front, less than half the Sherman's protection. The Type 1 Chi-He medium tank, Japan's most advanced operational design, managed 50 millimeters of frontal armor, but only a handful had been produced before manufacturing priorities shifted to aircraft production. The implications were stark. Sherman crews enjoyed protection that could defeat most Japanese anti-tank weapons at typical combat ranges, while Japanese armor was vulnerable to American guns at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The asymmetry meant that engagements would be decided by whoever fired first and most accurately, and American fire control advantages ensured that outcome would favor them in nearly every encounter. Lieutenant Tanaka examined the Sherman's suspension system with growing appreciation for design philosophy that prioritized reliability over the weight savings that Japanese doctrine demanded. The vertical volute spring suspension used individual coil springs for each of the 6 road wheels, providing excellent ground pressure distribution and surprisingly soft ride characteristics for a 30-ton vehicle. Japanese tanks used bell crank or simple leaf spring systems that were lighter but transmitted ground shock directly into the hull, fatiguing crews and making accurate fire while moving nearly impossible. The track itself represented another example of American industrial capacity translated into practical advantage. Each track link was a forged steel component, machined to precise tolerances and designed for easy replacement in the field. Japanese track links were often cast rather than forged, a cheaper manufacturing process that produced components more prone to fracture under stress. American tanks could operate at higher speeds over rough terrain because their tracks and suspension could absorb punishment that would immobilize Japanese vehicles. That afternoon, they tested the Sherman's mechanical reliability by running the engine continuously for 4 hours while monitoring temperature, oil pressure, and other vital parameters. The Wright Cyclone radial engine that powered this particular Sherman was essentially an aircraft engine adapted for ground use, producing 400 horsepower that seemed excessive for a tank, but provided power reserves that allowed sustained high-speed operation even under adverse conditions. Japanese tank engines were purpose-designed for armored vehicle use, typically air-cooled diesels that produced between 120 and 200 horsepower depending on the model. The lower power output limited speed and acceleration, but saved weight and reduced the logistical burden of gasoline supply. In theory, this was a reasonable trade-off. In practice, it meant Japanese tanks were slower, less maneuverable, and unable to execute the kind of rapid repositioning that characterized American armored tactics. The 4-hour test revealed the Sherman's engine running smoothly throughout with no signs of overheating or mechanical distress. Oil pressure remained stable, coolant temperature stayed within normal ranges, and the transmission shifted through all gears without difficulty. Sergeant Watanabe, who had extensive experience maintaining Japanese tank engines, was struck by how little attention the American engine required. Japanese engines demanded constant monitoring and adjustment to prevent overheating, and even then, mechanical failures were common enough to be considered normal operational losses. As the test concluded, Yamamoto compiled his observations into a technical summary that tried to remain objective despite the uncomfortable conclusions emerging from the data. The Sherman demonstrated superior firepower through faster reload speeds, better fire control through advanced optics and stabilization, stronger protection through thicker armor properly configured, and greater reliability through robust mechanical systems designed for sustained operation. In every measurable category, American tanks enjoyed decisive advantages that Japanese vehicles could not match without fundamental redesign. The question that haunted the cave during those 3 days was never spoken aloud but hung in the air like smoke. If American tanks were this superior, why had Japanese armor doctrine assumed they could be defeated through tactical skill and warrior spirit? The answer was uncomfortable because it required acknowledging that Japanese military planning had been based on assumptions that were obsolete before the war began. On the 4th morning, they received orders to destroy the Sherman and evacuate the cave. American infantry was advancing toward their position, and the captured tank could not be allowed to fall back into enemy hands. Yamamoto protested that the analysis was incomplete, that there were still tests to conduct and data to gather, but the orders were explicit. Destroy the vehicle and withdraw to defensive positions closer to Mount Suribachi. They spent the afternoon placing demolition charges around the Sherman's critical components, timing the destruction to occur after they had cleared the area. It felt like vandalism, destroying a machine that had taught them more about modern armored warfare in 3 days than years of combat reports from various fronts. The Sherman had been an honest teacher, revealing truths about American military effectiveness that no propaganda could obscure. Before they left, Yamamoto stood beside the turret one final time, his hand resting on steel that was still warm from the afternoon sun. He thought, about the American crews who operated these machines, wondering if they understood what advantages they possessed, or if superiority had become so routine they took it for granted. Japanese tankers went into battle knowing they were outgunned, out-armored, and outmaneuvered, yet they fought anyway because duty demanded sacrifice even when victory was impossible. The demolition charges detonated at sunset, the explosion echoing across the volcanic landscape like thunder. Flames consumed the Sherman's interior, melting the careful ergonomics and thoughtful design into slag. But the knowledge remained, carried in the minds of men who had measured the gap between Japanese capability and American reality and found it too wide to bridge through willpower alone. That night, scattered in defensive positions that would be overrun within days, Yamamoto's team wrote individual reports documenting what they had learned. The reports would never reach Tokyo, lost in the chaos of the island's fall, along with thousands of other documents that might have informed strategic decisions if anyone had been willing to listen. The Sherman test had quantified Japanese obsolescence, but obsolescence could not be corrected when the industrial base needed to produce modern equipment was being systematically destroyed by the same forces that built superior tanks. Lieutenant Tanaka died 2 days later when American flamethrower tanks burned out the cave complex his platoon was defending. Captain Saito survived until March 2nd before a 75mm shell from a Sherman, possibly one of the same model he had studied, penetrated his Type 97's thin armor and killed his entire crew instantly. Sergeant Watanabe made it to the final days of the battle before succumbing to wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical supplies, but those supplies had stopped reaching Iwo Jima weeks earlier. Major Yamamoto survived the battle through a combination of luck and the chaos that characterized the island's final collapse. He was among the roughly 1,000 Japanese personnel who were captured rather than killed, a fate considered shameful by the code that had governed his life. In American custody, he was questioned extensively about Japanese armor capabilities and doctrine, providing information that would inform intelligence assessments for the rest of the Pacific War. The interrogation reports from April 1945, now archived in American military history collections, contain Yamamoto's detailed technical descriptions of the Sherman test. His observations about the 7-second reload cycle were corroborated by American data showing that well-trained Sherman crews averaged 6 to 8 rounds per minute under combat conditions, exactly matching what he had measured in the cave. The reports also note his frank admission that Japanese tanks were fundamentally inadequate for modern warfare and that no tactical innovation could overcome the material disadvantages Japanese crews faced. Years later, after the war ended and he returned to a Japan transformed by occupation and reconstruction, Yamamoto would write a memoir that dedicated an entire chapter to those 3 days testing the captured Sherman. The memoir was published in 1953 and became required reading at the reconstituted Japanese Self-Defense Forces Armor School. His description of watching Watanabe achieve 7-second reload cycles became the central anecdote in a larger meditation on how industrial capacity, properly organized, creates military effectiveness that individual courage cannot overcome. In the memoir, Yamamoto wrote with the clarity that comes from years of reflection on painful truths. He described the confidence that filled the cave on that first morning, the certainty that Japanese engineering discipline and warrior spirit could match anything America's factories produced. He detailed the growing unease as each test revealed another layer of American advantage: the reload speed that doubled Japanese capabilities, the fire control that allowed accurate shooting while moving, the armor protection that rendered Japanese guns nearly useless at typical combat ranges. But the passage that military historians would quote most frequently came near the chapter's end, where Yamamoto reflected on the moment when the Sherman's breech closed for the 7th time in less than 50 seconds, and he realized that Japanese armor doctrine was built on foundations that could not support modern warfare's demands. He wrote, "We had believed that superior spirit could compensate for inferior material, that warrior virtues would triumph over industrial production. The Sherman taught us that warfare had become an engineering problem, and we had brought spiritual solutions to a mechanical challenge. The 7-second reload cycle was not merely faster than our 12-second cycle, It represented a philosophical gulf between two civilizations' approaches to organized violence, and we were on the wrong side of history. The American crews who operated Shermans in the Pacific never knew that Japanese officers had tested a captured example and been shocked by its reload speed. To them, the 6 to 8 rounds per minute they could sustain was simply normal performance, achieved through training that emphasized crew coordination and loading procedures practiced until they became automatic. The ergonomic design that allowed those speeds was invisible to them, assumptions baked into the vehicle's layout that they never thought to question. In tank battles across Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Philippines, American Sherman crews would engage Japanese armor and destroy it with methodical efficiency that seemed almost unfair to observers who didn't understand the technical advantages built into every component. Japanese Type 97 and Type 1 tanks would brave fire accurate enough to hit specific armor plates at 600 meters, only to find their own 47mm guns ineffective at ranges where Sherman 75mm guns could penetrate with certainty. The reload speed advantage that Yamamoto had measured in his cave translated into battlefield dominance that was absolute. American tanks could fire twice as often, reposition while maintaining fire, and concentrate overwhelming firepower on priority targets before Japanese crews could respond effectively. The tactical outcomes were predictable. Japanese armor would be destroyed in engagements where courage and tactical skill were irrelevant compared to superior equipment properly employed. Statistical analysis of tank versus tank engagements in the Pacific showed kill ratios that averaged 10 to 15 Japanese tanks destroyed for every American tank lost to enemy fire. These ratios reflected multiple advantages working in combination: armor protection, fire control, reload speed, mechanical, reliability. But the reload advantage was fundamental because it determined how many targets could be engaged in the critical seconds when battle outcomes were decided. The Sherman that Yamamoto tested was one of approximately 50,000 produced during World War II, part of an industrial mobilization that manufactured tanks faster than combat could destroy them. American factories were producing Shermans at rates exceeding 1,000 per month by late 1943, while Japanese industry struggled to build 100 tanks monthly across all types. The production advantage meant that even if kill ratios had been equal, which they were not, American armor would have achieved battlefield superiority through numerical superiority alone. Japanese armor production never recovered from the strategic decision to prioritize aircraft manufacturing over tank development after 1943. The few advanced designs that reached prototype stage, the Type 3 Chi-Nu, with a 75mm gun and improved armor, showed that Japanese engineers understood what was needed to compete with American tanks. But understanding came too late, and with too few resources to matter. The Type 3 Chi-Nu never saw combat, its handful of completed examples held in reserve for the invasion of the home islands that never came. The cave where Yamamoto conducted his test was captured by American Marines on February 24, 1945. The burned-out wreckage of the Sherman was photographed and documented, though the Americans who found it never learned about the 3-day analysis that had preceded its destruction. To them, it was simply another destroyed vehicle in a landscape littered with wreckage from both sides. The technical intelligence it might have provided was lost when Yamamoto's detailed written report was consumed in the flames that sanitized the cave before evacuation. But the knowledge survived in the memories of the men who had witnessed the test and in the oral tradition that passed among Japanese armor officers in the war's final months. The story of the 7-second reload became a cautionary tale, told in quiet moments when officers could speak honestly about the impossible situation they faced. It was repeated in dugouts on Okinawa and in training facilities in the home islands, becoming shorthand for the material disadvantages that made Japanese armor doctrine obsolete, regardless of crew quality or tactical innovation. The broader lesson that Yamamoto drew from the Sherman test extended beyond tank design to encompass Japan's entire approach to industrial warfare. American military effectiveness stemmed from design philosophy that assumed resources were available to optimize every component for human performance. Japanese design philosophy assumed resources were scarce, and optimization meant minimizing weight and manufacturing complexity, even when those choices degraded combat effectiveness. The Plate 4, Sherman's spacious interior that allowed 7-second reload cycles, was wasteful by Japanese standards because it used more steel and occupied more volume than absolutely necessary. But that waste translated into doubled firepower that made the difference between winning and losing tank engagements. Japanese tanks were efficient in manufacturing terms, requiring less raw material and simpler production processes, but they were ineffective in combat terms because efficiency had been measured by the wrong metrics. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt its military forces under American guidance, the lessons from Yamamoto's Sherman test would inform new tank designs that prioritized crew effectiveness over abstract measures of engineering efficiency. The Type 61 main battle tank that entered service in 1961 featured spacious crew compartments, ergonomic ammunition storage, and design philosophy that acknowledged human factors as legitimate engineering constraints. The reload cycle for its 90mm gun was comparable to contemporary American tanks, a deliberate design choice that reflected hard lessons learned in caves on volcanic islands, where Japanese armor had been systematically outclassed by opponents who understood modern warfare's true requirements. The narrator's voice carries weight of historical judgment as the story approaches its conclusion. The 7-second reload cycle that shocked Yamamoto in February 1945 was not an isolated technical achievement. It was a symptom of American industrial culture that measured success by outcomes rather than inputs, that valued effectiveness over elegance, and that understood modern warfare as a systems engineering problem rather than a test of spiritual strength. Japanese armor failed in the Pacific not because Japanese tankers lacked courage, but because Japanese industry produced equipment optimized for the wrong criteria, and no amount of warrior spirit could reload a gun faster than ergonomics allowed. The final irony that Yamamoto would reflect on in his memoir was that Japanese engineers understood good design principles, but were constrained by strategic decisions and resource limitations that forced compromises American designers never faced. Given unlimited steel and manufacturing capacity, Japanese engineers could have built tanks comparable to the Sherman. But they never had those resources, and their design choices reflected the scarcity that defined Japan's entire war effort. The Sherman test revealed not Japanese engineering incompetence, but Japanese industrial inadequacy, and that inadequacy was baked into strategic decisions made years before the first shot was fired. As the sun set over the Pacific on islands where these lessons were learned in blood and fire, the Sherman tanks that survived combat were already being declared obsolete by American planners looking ahead to the next generation of armored vehicles. The 7-second reload cycle that had seemed so impressive to Japanese observers in 1945 was merely adequate by the standards American designers were already working toward. The gap between Japanese capability and American reality was not static but growing, widening with every month that American industry operated at full mobilization while Japanese production withered under blockade and bombardment. The cave on Iwo Jima, where Major Yamamoto learned these truths, was eventually buried by volcanic sand and forgotten by everyone except the few survivors who carried the memory of those 3 days when technical analysis revealed uncomfortable truths about technological obsolescence and strategic failure. The Sherman itself was nothing but burned wreckage, its sophisticated reload mechanisms and thoughtful ergonomics reduced to twisted metal. But what it represented, American industrial power translated into combat effectiveness through intelligent design, survived in the form of battlefield dominance that would characterize every remaining engagement of the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.